Welcome to the European Parliament. My name is Dan Sobowitz, and in this series, I'll be talking with policy analysts of the European Parliamentary Research Service about European defense. In recent times, we're hearing more and more about the idea of boosting European defense readiness, how to reinforce our defense and improve the efficiency of its spending. In this first episode, I'm joined in the studio by Sebastian Klapp, EPRS policy analyst working on Europe's defense industry. Hi, Sebastian. Good to have you in the studio.
Hi, Dan.
So to put this conversation into context, how did the current Russian war in Ukraine impact Europe's defense industry?
So the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine has dramatically changed the European security landscape. It has revealed the European defense industry's limitations in meeting heightened demand for military equipment. And it has also been a wake-up call for the EU, highlighting the urgent need for the EU to strengthen its defense capacities, but also to boost the European defense industry, which is so essential to supply European armies.
So a wake-up call for an industry which is of what scale?
The European defense industry comprises large prime contractors, mid-caps, and a very large amount of SMEs. It has an annual turnover of around 70 billion euros and employs approximately 500,000 people. The large prime contractors, such as Airbus Defence and Space, Thales, Indra, and Leonardo, are primarily centered in France, Italy, Germany, Spain, and Sweden. But an equally important role is played by smaller but essential companies that are based throughout the whole of the European Union.
So it sounds huge. How does that compare to other parts of the world?
To give the example of the United States, the EU defense companies are significantly outmatched by their US counterparts in terms of revenue. The largest defense contractor in the world, the US-based Lockheed Martin, has an annual revenue of around 60 billion euros, and that is almost as much as the entire EU-based defense industry.
Okay, so high figures, but not comparable to what we're seeing on the other side of the Atlantic. So what are the main challenges keeping Europe's defense industry from reaching its full potential?
First of all, it is very important to mention that the European defense industry is competitive at a global level, but it is constrained by mainly four issues. First of all, long-term underinvestment. Secondly, fragmentation on both the demand and the supply side.
Along national lines.
Precisely, yeah. Thirdly, dependency on third countries on things such as critical raw materials and microchips. And fourthly, limited defense production capacity.
Okay, let me pick on the first challenge that you mentioned, which was underinvestment. Can you give us some figures?
Of course. So the European Commission has actually calculated that had the 27 EU member states spent 2% of their GDP on defense in accordance with the NATO defense spending guideline between 2006 and 2020, this would have resulted in an additional 1.1 trillion euros for defense spending. With 20% of that dedicated to defense investment, that would have been an additional 270 billion euros available for defense. And a problem with the already comparatively small defense budgets is that a lot of the defense budget is actually not spent in Europe, but abroad. The French think tank EDIS has estimated that between February 2022 and June 2023, 78% of defense acquisitions by EU member states were done abroad.
And why is that important?
Because a lot of the actual money that would be available for defense investment is invested in foreign defense industries rather than in Europe.
Okay, fair enough. So to go back, you mentioned underinvestment, you mentioned fragmentation along national borders, you mentioned dependency on other parts of the world and limited production capacity. But we're having this conversation here in the European Parliament. So where does the EU come in? Its institutions and particularly the Parliament.
Of course, so the EU in recent years has taken significant steps to reinforce the European defense industry. And I'll just name a couple of examples.
Yeah.
For instance, the European Defense Fund with a budget of 8 billion euros finances joint defense research and capability development. The European defense industry reinforcement through Common Procurement Act with a budget of 310 million euros.
Short, crispy name for this act.
Short, crispy name, precisely. Incentivizes joint procurement of the most urgent defense products. the Act in Support of Ammunition Production, or ASAP, with a budget of 500 million euros, aims to boost European defense production capacity, especially for ammunition and missiles. And then furthermore, the EU Chips Act and the EU Critical Raw Materials Act aims to ensure a sustainable supply of critical raw materials and microchips.
Which I presume are necessary for the defense industry.
Precisely, these are essential components for the European defense industry. And then finally, in March of 2024, the Commission and High Representative put forward the first ever European Defense Industrial Strategy, and the European Commission also tabled a proposal for a European Defense Industry Program regulation.
So you mentioned many different initiatives of the EU, many different bills and funding. Let me pick on the last two that you mentioned. First, it was the strategy. So what can you tell us about what's in this European Defense Industrial Strategy?
Certainly. So the European Defense Industrial Strategy sets a vision for EU defense industrial policy until 2035, with the aim to boost the EU's defense readiness. Key actions include enhancing the European defense industry by investing more, better together, and European, boosting the European defense industry's responsiveness and innovation, options for financing the European Union's ambition to achieve this defense industrial readiness, but also cooperation with strategic international and like-minded partners. Additionally, it also includes non-binding goals for defense readiness. One of them would be, for instance, that by 2030, 40% of defense acquisition should be done in a collaborative manner.
So this is the strategy, and then you also mentioned the European Defense Industry Program, so that's also part of the strategy?
Yes, so the European Defense Industry Program is the first means to deliver the European Defense Industrial Strategy. It will provide a budget of 1.5 billion euros for the period 2025 to 2027. It will strengthen the competitiveness, resilience, and responsiveness of the European defense industry. It will also foster cooperation with the Ukrainian defense industry, provide a toolbox, most notably, however, a new legal framework for defense cooperation throughout the whole life cycle of defense equipment, but it will also ensure the availability and steady supply of defense products.
So these are all elements of the European Defense Industry Program, also known as EDIP. And where does the European Parliament that we're sitting in, come in?
So the European Parliament will be essential in EDIP, as EDIP is subject to the ordinary legislative procedure, which means that the European Parliament will be on an equal footing with the Council and will be instrumental in shaping this future regulation.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you, Sebastian, for shedding a light on this industry, its capacity, challenges, and the range of EU solutions when it comes to EU defense. It seems like a lot is at stake for Europe's defense industry and a lot on the agenda for the current mandate of the European Parliament. In the next episode, I'll be talking with your colleague, Marco Centrone, about defense spending, how to spend not only more together in European, but also in a better, more efficient way. So thanks for watching or listening, and see you in the next episode of the EPRS series on EU defense.